Hello and welcome to the 16th video in this series, making a space shooter using HTML and JavaScript. In this video we're going to add some explosions when the enemies blow up when they're hit by a bullet. We're going to do this using some PNGs of explosions and using CSS animations to show the explosion effect. In the project folder, and you can find these on GitHub, I've added explosions inside the assets, and we've got explosion 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And what we're going to do is play those in quick succession to give us the effect of an explosion occurring. To do this, we're going to go inside styles.css. I'm going to paste some code in here because it's stuff you've seen before, keyframes, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's some code to write later on. We're going to have a set of keyframes here saying that our explosion animation, basically every 20% steps through the animation will change the background image, 0, 1, 0, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, and then towards the end we'll also make the images steadily more transparent so we get this kind of dissipating effect of the explosion rather than it disappearing in a cold hard way. Well, our explosions will be a div with a class that's set, and we're going to call that class explosion, and it's going to have a fixed height and width. If I don't delete all of the text, it's going to have a fixed height and width on it of 100 pixels. That's certainly bigger than the images. We're going to set the background repeat to no repeats. That doesn't repeat the image across the 100 width, 100 wide and 100 high set height we have for this div. We'll position it absolutely, and for now we'll fix a left and a top. I'll take those out in a bit, just so we can show an explosion on the screen. We'll use our explosion animation, keyframes. We'll make it last for 2 seconds for now, and I'll change that later on. And it has a Z index of 20, so at least it's below the text but above the enemies. To demonstrate the effect, we can quickly add a div into index.html. So explosion, if I can spell that correctly, and then I'll go to the browser and just refresh, and you can see we get a nice explosion effect on the screen there. I'll go back into styles.css and just change the animation duration to 0.5. Go back to the browser, refresh, and now we get a much quicker explosion, which is more the effect I'd like to see when we blow up the ship. Okay, to get this going then inside the program, we need to make some changes. Looking in the styles.css, we're using explosion PNGs 0 to 5 here. There are actually more available inside the folder, and in fact in defs.js I'm going to add on all of them up to 8 because I've been playing around with how the effect looks of the explosion, so I've been using different images, so I'll put them in there for you anyway, and we'll load them all when the program first loads. I'm going to add a constant down the bottom in the game settings called an explosion timeout, and last but not least we're going to maintain a reference to our explosions inside the game manager, and as we did for player and bullets we'll keep that undefined for now. The next thing to do is add an explosion.js to our project and include it in the HTML. And we're going to need to make a modification to our sprite. We're going to need to add a small function to the end of our sprite class, and that is called getTheCenterPoint. And this is just to return a point object whose x and y is the center point of the sprite in question. Why? Well, we're going to want to position the explosion right over the center of the enemy that's been hit or is dying from the bullet hit. So we'll need the enemy's center point. And that could be something useful for all sprites, so we'll put this as part of the sprite class. And the only thing that could potentially be tricky in this to remember is that we're doing the position minus the anchor shift, because the anchor shift gets set as negative in the constructor, you'll remember, of the sprite here. So we have a double negative, so it's effectively a plus. So that'll get us the center point then of our sprites in the game, and we'll be using that to position our explosions. So into explosion.js then, so we'll make an explosion class, give it a constructor, and this will take the asset name. We'll set the count to 0. This will be used to maintain the count of the number of explosions we've made, much like the bullets and the enemies, and allows us to assign individual ID names to the divs. We're going to set an offset parameter. This will be very much like the anchor point. I mean, I could have subclassed sprite for this, but in the uses for this game I don't really need to. I haven't got very much code. I'm going to call here set offset asset name, and this will just be the asset name. In this case is always the starting explosion, which then changes with the various keyframes. So the set offset function, we get the asset first of all from our game manager assets that load at the start, so we know the size of the asset, and then we can set our offset to be a new point taking into account our asset. So much like the anchor shift in the sprite class, then we have our asset width divided by 2 times -1 and height divided by 2 times -1 to set our offset. So this is done when we first create an explosion. Now we'll have the create explosion function. And in fact, I'm going to rename this class explosions with an S because it's actually the class that deals with all of the explosions. So to create the explosion, we're going to make a div, and then we're going to have this div have the explosion class, and then we're going to give an ID according to how many explosions we've created so far. Now we can set the styling, so the left and the top, so the actual position of the explosion. So we offset this then by X and by our offset Y, so the same as the anchor shift concept. Then we can append to the play area div the new div with the explosion that we've created, and because it's got the explosion class, it'll start animating the explosions. And last thing to do is set a timeout. We don't need to keep a reference of this timeout. And in this timeout, what we'll do is we'll simply use jQuery to select our div and remove it. So after 1 second, which was the explosion timeout I think that we set, here it is, we will remove this div. And it's so quick we don't need to worry about syncing that with the game end or anything like this. Last but not least, at the end of this function then we can increment the count to say that we've created an explosion. And that's all we need for our explosions class. So our game manager will have one of these objects. It'll be created with the asset name of the first explosion PNG that's used. We create the offset then, which is the anchor point for all explosions, and then every time we need an explosion we'll call create explosion with the position that we want to create it at, which will probably in most cases be in the middle of an enemy sprite. We'll make sure we offset it with the offset so that it appears directly over the enemy, add it to the div, and then remove it after 1 second, bearing in mind that the whole animation for the explosion takes half a second, so we're not going to cut anything off early. Now that we've done that, we need to go into enemy.js, and in our enemy collection we're going to take a reference to the explosions which will be passed in main.js from the game manager. And now in the update, where an enemy gets killed, which is here, we'll get the center point of the enemy, so we'll call that CP, is equal to en dot. So that's using the new function we've written in the sprite class, and now we can create an explosion. And that's all we need to do now to have an explosion exploding on the screen. The last thing is to set the explosions object up in main.js. And here, just above reset bullets, I'm going to drop a function in called reset explosion. So the explosions in the game manager is a new explosions object with the first of the PNGs used for an explosion as the asset that's sent in, so we can get the sizes and things like that. Then we reset explosions down in the reset game, which can come before the enemies. And then in the reset enemies, we need to send in an argument. I'll just try and make this a little more readable for the resolution we have on the screen. So game manager dot explosions, and we send that in as well to our enemy collection. And that should be all we need to do, I say with a lot of hope, to see the explosions on the screen when we hit the enemies. So let's see if we can look at that. I'll just go back to defs.js and check how often we're firing bullets. Let's fire them every 200 milliseconds again. And now back to the app and refresh. Okay, and I had a small typo or typing error when I refreshed the browser because I'd not put a big S in here and I had here, so I'll try that again. So we'll start the game and see if we can shoot some enemies. and you can see the explosions appearing over the enemies. Very good. The only thing is we've got that annoying explosion by default at the start, so I'm just going to go and remove the div from the index.html. Go back to the browser, just try once more, start off the game, the stars start scrolling, wander around the screen, and there you can see we're nicely destroying our enemies. I just want to get hit, and now you can see we're not firing anymore, and I did manage to catch one of those. Okay, so that's good. Then that's a bit of CSS, not really much more, a little bit of code in the explosions.js, and we've got nice explosion effects on top of the enemies. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Comments, questions, always welcome, and otherwise see you in the next one. Thank you very much.